Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had about oversteer and understeer. Are you like me and hear the term oversteer and understeer and try to wrap your brain around what exactly it means? Well, Dick and I had a discussion and he explained basic concepts related to understeer and oversteer, things like slip angles, handling balance, and driving styles. And for non-racers in particular, I think this will help us in understanding how this impacts other aspects we've already discussed: setup, development, and even how teams may consider which drivers to put in their cars. But before we get to the conversation, I need to take a moment to ask, have you subscribed to or followed the show on your favorite podcast app? Have you shared the show with your fellow F1 fans? If not, can you take a moment to do so now? For an indie podcast like us, that's how we grow. To those who've already done so, the guys and I thank you. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Dick, another one of these tech talks that we've been doing. Are you ready for it?
I am ready. The question is, are you ready for it?
I feel like that's the proverbial question every time we do this is the non-racer, non-STEM person going to be able to keep up with you, professor of all things technological and racecraft and race engineering? But we'll see. We'll see.
Well, and I've had a good dinner, so I have a lot of extra energy tonight. So you could be in trouble.
and then in my case, my voice is going out. So I'm going to be very careful about how much I speak. But I think you're going to be able to do a great job on answering something that I keep hearing about, which is the term understeer and oversteer and handling balance and all sorts of terms that I'm not really sure I understand. So can you help me out, Dick? What is understeer?
Oh, it's simple. Understeer is when the front of your car hits the wall first.
Okay, Dick, that's not helpful.
Oh, yeah, but it's true. Oh, it's so true.
Okay. No, okay. Oversteer then.
Oversteer. Well, that's when it's just the reverse. It's when the back of your car hits the wall first.
Dick, you've got to be serious. No, this isn't fair. You got to tell me, really, I mean, what is oversteer and understeer?
Well, first of all, we need to have a few extra definitions since we're talking about hitting the wall. First of all, horsepower is not what you think it is. Horsepower only is what determines how hard you hit the wall, whereas RPM determines how fast you hit the wall, and torque is all about how far you move the wall. And then there's this thing called stagger, which is what you do after you hit the wall. So anyway, okay, I'm done.
Dick, I'm serious. You've got to get serious. Our audience is probably those who are STEM like you and engineers totally get it. But the nons like me are going, okay, now I really feel like I'm on a different planet. So you got to be serious for us right now.
I'm the guy on the different planet. But yeah, really and truly, oversteer and understeer, it's a really, really big deal. And we talk about handling balance. And it really starts leading into a deeper conversation about, like, why is it that Max drives a car that's set up in a way that nobody else can drive it, or very few people can drive it? And so this is kind of laying some foundational stuff. We'll talk about Max some other time, although we'll probably talk about him a little bit. But here's what's interesting. There's this thing called slip angles. And think of it in these terms. If you go into a corner that's, say, a 90-degree corner, okay, let's say you're going to turn left, you have to turn the steering wheel a certain number of degrees to make that car go around that 90-degree corner. Now, you're not going to have to turn it 90 degrees. You're not going to turn the wheels, the front wheels that far, but you're going to turn them a certain number of degrees. If you have understeer, what that really means is that you've turned the wheels a certain number of degrees. Let's just make it real easy and say you're turning the steering, the front tires a total of 15 degrees, right? They're instead of being straight ahead, they're turned in 15 degrees to the left. But the car is traveling on a path that's more like 12 degrees. So that difference between the 12 degrees that you're actually driving on and the 15 degrees that the wheels are turned to is a 3-degree difference, right? And that's called your slip angle. And so understeer happens when the slip angles at the front of the car are greater than the slip angles at the rear of the car. And I know what you're going to say. say, hold it, wait a second. How is it that there's slip angles at the rear? Because we all know the rear tires stay straight ahead. They don't, turn into the corner. And that's very true. But those tires, irregardless, they slide a little bit. And so they're at a certain angle, and yet the back end of the car is going at a certain angle. So they're generating a slip angle as well. And so while understeer happens when the slip angles at the front of the car are greater than the slip angles at the rear of the car, oversteer is just the opposite. The slip angles at the rear are greater than the slip angles at the front. Another way to think about it is that understeer is when the rear of the car has more grip than the front tires, and oversteer is when the front of the car has more grip than the rear of the car. Okay, so if you have an oversteering car, even though those front tires are not as wide as the rear tires, they are generating more grip, either because of aerodynamics or mechanical advantage. Something's going on that's causing them to have more grip overall. And so the front end turns very easily, whereas the rear of the car doesn't turn quite so easily. And so that slip angle becomes bigger and grip goes down. Does that kind of make sense?
I think it does. And I guess the question that as I'm listening to you that's forming in my mind is, those angles are as a result of the driver turning the steering wheel.
Correct.
When I hear you say that there's that 12 and 15 degrees differential of 3, that's looking at it from the turn of the front wheels. And then you're saying that this is also seen in the back. Even though the wheels are technically pointing forward, there will be some level of slip. And so all of this is components of either under or oversteer, depending on where the differential is happening between the front and the back. Is that a correct restatement? Right. Can I ask one more?
Sure.
Okay. So, and then you said that the size of the tire, so that even is another component of this. The tire size will probably affect that 3-degree, using your example. Like if it's a bigger tire, that slip we won't see as much, versus a smaller tire, it may go a little bit more into that angle. Is that correct as well?
That's exactly right. And, the other part of it, though, is that it's very possible to generate more grip at the front of the car just because maybe the front wing is producing, is adjusted to produce more downforce, or, there could be any number of things that would cause the front tires, even though they're smaller than the rears, it could cause it to have more grip, more total grip.
That goes to the things you've already talked about of mechanical versus aerodynamic grip.
Yes.
Like
absolutely.
Any of those could be affecting how those front tires are responding, which then in turn can affect the slip angle that we're talking about now.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
The fact that I understood that is a pretty remarkable thing. So keep going, Professor.
All right. So I kind of made a bit of a feeble joke about understeer, oversteer, and all that kind of stuff, but it's not really far from the truth, because if you have a car that understeers heavily, it's going to go off the track nose first. And a car that oversteers heavily is going to go sliding off the track rear first, or at least it's going to try to do that, right? And so for most people, the easy way to remember it all is that oversteer is what most people would refer to as just your common slide. If you see a car chase in a movie or something like that, those cars are, the tails are hanging out and all that kind of stuff, that's oversteer. Okay. And while having a ton of either oversteer or understeer is not a good thing, all racing drivers want some of either, or even both, depending on their driving style. And so this then leads us to a discussion on the handling balance. But before we get too deep into that, let's talk about a couple of concepts that I want you and our listeners to understand first. So the thing to remember about understeer is that understeer is actually quite benign. And by that, I mean, it's much safer and easier to deal with. And that's why all road cars are designed to have some understeer built into them. It's not to say that you couldn't take your street legal Ferrari or Corvette or whatever and hang the tail out with a whole bunch of oversteer, but they are designed to promote understeer. And the reason it's done that way say is that because your typical driver doesn't know how to deal with oversteer. When a car understeers in a corner, it produces what we call front tire drag, right? If you think about it, when you turn the wheels, those tires actually act like a brake, okay? And so when they do that, the car automatically starts slowing down just because you've turned the steering wheel. And so if the car is pushing away from the inside of a corner, the only cure that you really have for that is to let the car slow down, turn the steering wheel a bit more into the corner, and eventually the front tires will gain some grip because the slip angle eventually reduces because you're not turning the steering wheel quite so much. And you go on down the road, okay? That is pretty much the normal way understeer works. And so it's a very safe and predictable kind of thing. So the street car that you drive, you're going to have to work to get the tail to hang out on it. You know, the front of the car will understeer, or as NASCAR drivers call it, they'll push, which is the same thing. And it will actually force you to slow down so that grip will eventually come back to those front tires. Okay. This is not the case with oversteer. When a car oversteers, the back end of the car is stepping out and the car is sliding at the back. Now, many road drivers who aren't experienced, let's say you're driving in the wintertime and you hit some ice and the back of the car starts to slide. You know, that's a pretty common deal. And again, taking that left-hand corner, a lot of drivers would mistakenly feel the back end of the car sliding out underneath them and turn the steering wheel more to the left in an attempt to save themselves. But actually, they've just made it worse. And so what they've done is set themselves up to spin the car out. The real thing to do with an oversteering car, again, you're in a left-hand corner and the car is oversteering, you actually start steering the car to the right because it changes the radius of the corner, the slip angles change, get more imbalance, and then all of a sudden the grip comes back and the car, you know, sticks better and you're motoring off down the road. So that's kind of how that works, okay? The thing that's interesting is that you can actually use understeer and oversteer to your advantage. And by that I mean most racing drivers prefer a car that is just a little bit, it's a tad understeery going into the corner. So, you know, you're coming down a straightaway and you're heading into your left-hand corner that we've been talking about. And the driver comes off the gas, gets on the brakes, downshifts, and turns into the corner. And when he turns into the corner, that car begins to understeer just ever so much, ever so slightly. Okay, it's not a whole bunch, but it is a little bit. And so the car is stable. The rear of the car is stable and planted, and it gives that driver a sense of security. And so the driver then is better able to control the car with it being turned, and he can brake at the same time, which is an advantage because if he had to get all his braking done in a straight line and then turn the steering wheel, he'd have to brake sooner. But the top guys, what they do is they come much deeper into the corner before they get on the brakes. They jump on the brakes super, super hard. And then as they turn the steering wheel, they start coming off of the brake pedal so they're not exerting as much pressure on the brake pedal, but they're still exerting quite a bit of pressure on that pedal. And as the steering wheel turns more to the left, the pedal comes off more and more until finally, by the time they're at the center of the corner, what we call the apex, they're completely off the brakes, okay? Now, what's interesting is once the car is at the apex of the turn, obviously he starts reducing the amount of steering input, right? And so the front tires start gaining grip, and then he starts applying throttle, and the car will gently transition then from that mild understeer to mild oversteer, which eliminates all the front wheel drag that we were just caused by the steering wheel being turned due to that little bit of understeer that's into the corner. And just the mere fact of turning the car in is creating that drag. So the car is now what we call freed up. When it starts to oversteer, it's not dragging the car down anymore. It's actually, hopefully, putting the power down fairly effectively and rocketing off of the corner. So it's a very delicate dance, and it's all based on how much traction in terms of G-force the tire can generate. And the idea is if that tire can generate, I don't know, 4 Gs of grip, whether that's lateral or longitudinal, the driver, the really brilliant ones, are trying to keep it in the corner between, sort of 3.9 Gs and 4 Gs. It's right on that knife edge. And so they're balancing the car all the way through the corner. So that's the classic driver. That's a Lewis Hamilton. That's a Fernando Alonso. A little bit of understeer going in, a little bit of oversteer coming out of the corner.
What I'm hearing you say is some of the other, I guess, sports. I'm not a big sports person. We've already discussed this in other situations, but it feels like when I watch ice skaters and how they have to harness their power, especially, they're using their legs, but in the turns and the angles at which they attack either the ice to be able to slide and propel, gain that energy. It sounds like that's very similar to what the racing car drivers are doing with the pedals and the turn of the steering wheel and the tires, of knowing, like, are you using an inner angle versus an outer angle, and how much power versus how much are you allowing the body, the natural momentum to do. And in the case of the ice skaters, but in the case of the driver, they know their slip angles, they understand their car, the car's stability, suspension, downforce, all of that. And so then they're now able to not fight the car, but they know how, like, it's going to react. So that's when you talked about the attacking of the corner, or the movement of when to release the steering wheel or turn the steering wheel, release the brake, give the gas. As you said, it's a delicate dance of really being truly one. When you guys talk about being one with the car, this is really that in motion, in action. Right. Am I correct?
Right. Yeah. The driver is sensing the grip through his hands, because he's feeling the grip of the front tires in his hands. He's feeling the throttle and the brake with his feet. So judging, how much brake do I have right now, or how much throttle can I give the car, right? And then, not to put too fine a point on it, but, the driver's backside is feeling what the back of the car is doing. And so it's that, that super processor that we call the brain. It's taking all those sensory inputs from, the hands, the feet, the backside, and then their eyes. And they're like, oh, okay, they're processing, thousands of pieces of information every second, probably. And they're constantly making these very small little adjustments. And that, of course, is where their genius comes in.
Well, and as you were saying that, it made me think of the evolution of the Formula One car and the power steering versus not power steering, how that must affect what we're talking about quite dramatically. And knowing how to take the data, that's the only word I can think of, that the brain is processing in that moment. And also the time that in the seat that the driver is really gaining that knowledge of being able to feel that level of trust in the car or in their racecraft. And that oversteer and understeer, how valuable of knowing what you're comfortable with, communicating that to your team, and knowing, if the car isn't optimized for you, how are you going to then modify yourself to still be able to run that car? Like, not everybody gets to choose that, I guess. Is it an understeer, oversteer car? So then you may have to change your driving style.
Yep.
Am I right?
That is 100% right. And that's just a brilliant segue, actually, into having a quick conversation about Max, right? Because Max, unlike most of the guys, he likes a car that is kind of oversteery on corner entry and on corner exit. So the car is constantly sliding, okay? And I'm sure I would love to see video of him driving like a shifter cart, but my guess is that this was his style in karting, and he just kind of kept it that way. But so because the car is constantly sliding, you have to be very, very patient on the brakes and the throttle. And of course, patience is a relative term here, right? To get the speed out of the car that Max is able to get out of it. But this is why it's so difficult to be Max's teammate, because most drivers, think about Sergio. If I had to guess, I don't know this, but if I had to guess, he probably prefers the more traditional, a little bit of understeer going in, a little bit of oversteer coming out, whereas Max kind of likes the car to be sliding around all the time. So if we think about like some of the heroes of Formula One from way back when, Gilles Villeneuve, Ronnie Peterson, Jody Scheckter, those guys, if you go out to YouTube and just look up their driving style, man, those guys are sideways. It's just crazy the kind of oversteer those guys are generating. But of course, a very different era. They didn't have near the downforce they have today. And the tires back then were quite happy operating at very high degrees of slip angle, whereas the tires from today don't do that. So the cars today, even with Max, look a lot more planted and on rails, so to speak.
Yeah, I have to say that I can see that even as a novice. That when you say the planted, I guess I always assumed it was all about the ground effect and downforce, but now when you bring in the tires, that makes sense too to me. And I imagine there's probably a lot more into that, but I'm glad you pointed that out. That's really good and helpful for those of us who are trying to understand this better.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a big, and this has been going on for decades, but there's a big conversation about, well, do you want to be a driver that enters a corner maybe a little bit more slowly, but you get the car straightened out sooner at the apex of the corner, and you therefore get on the gas just a little bit sooner, and so you come out of the corner faster that way? Slow in a little bit slow in, a little bit fast out. Or are you better off being a little bit fast in, carrying more speed into the corner at the risk of being a little bit slow out because you have to straighten the car up later in the corner and therefore get on the gas later? Because if you're turning the steering wheel very much and you're putting that kind of power on the ground, the car is going to snap on you. So you have to be very judicious with how you apply the throttle and when you apply the throttle. There are some guys, though, Max is one of them, Nigel Mansell is one of them, where they have figured out how to carry a whole ton of speed into the apex of the corner. And then they're somehow able to get the car straightened out and back on the throttle at the same point or nearly the same point as the more traditional drivers do. And understand it's not a huge difference. And guys like Alonso and Hamilton obviously are brilliant with their driving style. But every once in a while you come across one of these guys that's able to just pitch the car in with the tail hanging out and then get it somehow straightened up so they can get back on the throttle. So they're fast in, fast out, but it's a very rare guy that can do that.
Well, that's interesting to me because that as we look at Max's dominance, how now you got my wheels turning. But you did mention Fernando and Lewis, and that they have a different style. Like, are they more traditional in how they approach things?
Yeah, they're more the slow in, slow out. Slow in, fast out kind of driver. Mm-hmm. They're going to trail brake into the corner. And by trail brake, I mean you're turning the car and at the same time still applying the brakes. So they're carrying their speed further past the point where they enter the corner. Whereas Max probably is not braking as much once he turns the steering wheel, but he's relying on the back of the car to slide around a little bit and scrub off speed that way. So he's using the rear tire sliding to scrub off speed, whereas Fernando and Lewis are using the brakes to do that.
And then when you think of their level of dominance of the sport, and then the cars at that time, I feel like there's so many sub conversations we could have from this. Oh, yeah. But it's fascinating to me because then you can see like the design of the car, the optimization, and like the regs, and who in their style matched up with the car at that right moment. How have they been set up to really show their racing talent and maximize the car that's being built?
Yeah.
Wow. So then looking at our current time, like with Aston Martin and Fernando, he's a great example, I think, because he's transcended multiple rig changes. What do you see about him and his more traditional approach, or even Lewis?
Yeah. So, Fernando obviously in 2023 had a car that suited him really well, right? I mean, it really suited him well. And so you saw the performance that was there. And it was only when the other teams began developing their car and catching up and eventually passing Aston Martin, did it, then his Alonso's brilliance start getting hidden because the other teams were out developing Aston Martin. And so, kind of a case in point, if you think about Aston Martin, they introduced a whole bunch of new upgrades in their car for Imola, right? And the Aston Martin actually wound up changing in a way that the team had not planned on. In that, yes, the upgrades did work. The car did go faster, although if they gained 3/10, the opposition gained 5/10. I mean, so it wasn't enough of an upgrade. But the other thing that is just now starting to come out is that Lance Stroll and Fernando both commented that with this new upgrade, the car was now way more difficult to drive. And when he was pressed on the topic by the various motorsports journalists, Stroll confessed that the car now oversteers into the corner and then understeers out of the corner under power. And that's why, and this is subjective on my part, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. This is why Alonso struggled so much and actually had that very uncharacteristic off in free practice 3 at Imola. Now, I think they must have kind of sort of started to figure out, because had Fernando not been held up in Q1 at Monaco, he would have been about P5 in Q1. So it may very well be that they're starting to find the handle on the car, but for Imola, for sure, you had a car that was oversteering into the corner and understeering out. Now, here's the thing. Understeer out of a corner is never good because of the front tire drag that's slowing you down from turning that steering wheel too much, right? So a good way to think about front tire drag is just go hop into your car, or have a friend hop into your car, better yet, and put the transmission in neutral. And then you get behind the car and start pushing it in a straight line, and notice how much effort it takes to push the car. And then you get moving the car, and then you ask your friend to turn the steering wheel a bit, and then all of a sudden just see how much harder it is to push the car. It gets a whole bunch harder without very much steering input put into it. That's the problem with having understeer on the exit of a corner. It consumes a whole bunch of power because the front tires are inducing that drag. So if you think about a racing car at the limit that is having to overcome the drag of those big front tires, which are turned too sharply into the corner due to that understeer that's being developed at the exit of the corner, you can easily understand why a car that understeers at the exit of the corner is not ideal, and it's going to be slow.
That makes a lot of sense when you talk about the hypothetical. Yeah, because the tire is not going really where you're needing it to go, and it's causing you're going to have to overcome that, and the car's wanting to go in a different direction. That makes sense. And I really want to also highlight what you said about those. We're talking about Imola 2024, these upgrade package, and connect it to something else that we've talked about, some of our other race reviews as well as our other tech conversations, that the fact that they brought the upgrade, it had an impact on understeer, and that the chase of the development and how you bring something in, think it's going to work, but then it creates a whole nother slew of problems that you weren't anticipating.
Right.
And I think that that's so helpful for us to keep in mind as we watch both the practical implications of under and oversteer, whichever choices, but that's the calculations the teams are making as they're going through the development. Like,
Right.
what are we going to, which direction are we going to go? And, or we don't have a clear understanding. Let's take one option and see what happens. And then you have to figure out if that was a good choice at the next race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it in some respects about racing is that you've got all this technology, wind tunnels and CFD and simulators and all this stuff. And all of it is brilliant, amazing stuff. And yet you do your very best efforts, and surprise, you suddenly have a handling balance that nobody can drive. Yep, the car is doing what it's supposed to do, but nobody can drive it. It's a very fascinating, it's very fascinating. It's part of what I love because it also keeps the human element in there.
The pursuit of excellence, and really in some ways even perfection, is that truly attainable when it's man and machine and all the variables that are going to be there that nobody can actually control? I think that's probably what the allure is for those of us who really love watching motorsport, and hope that those who are listening, especially who aren't necessarily racers, are really technologically minded like me, but can still, maybe we're implicitly connecting with that. That's part of it. And now we're just trying to be a little bit more explicit about it. Dick, help us to have a little bit of a general rule of thumb when we're looking at this, about a car.
So the general rule of thumb, again, is going to be for most drivers, unless you have somebody who just approaches their racing differently, like a Max, you're going to want to have that slight amount of understeer at quarter entry to inspire confidence in the driver. They're going to feel that really planted, solid rear end of the car. It's got all that grip and it's stable. And so that gives them the confidence to hurl that car into the corner and up to the apex of the corner. And then once that steering wheel starts to be released from the corner, you want that car to go just that slight oversteering mode with the tail hanging out maybe just a little bit, just to free it up a little so that you can just put the power down and just rock it off of the corner.
Because as I was even hearing that, I was thinking about the implication of even driver pairing decisions. And like what teams have to think about. And so having this understanding of the general rule of thumb of how you want to approach your car or how the driver is doing that helps us to understand as we see teams making decisions about the design of their car or which drivers are going to put into the car. This is one component of a myriad of components that the team has to factor in, let alone like the financials and the sponsorship and all those other kind of things that they're dealing with.
And honestly, Sabrina, what you just said there is actually quite profound, because there are teams, and you see it in IndyCar as well, where they will go and they will look at their drivers and they'll say, oh yeah, both of these guys are really, really quick. And they have very similar driving styles. So the data that we have coming off of both cars should correlate with one another. And so if I make a change on car A and it works, then we can put that same change on car B and it will also work for that driver as well.
Wow. Well, okay. So then that makes me think of, for example, right now it's 2024 Williams. It's been very well broadcast that Williams's decisions and like financially and even some of their technical aspects have been problematic over the years. And they had to make some really hard financial decisions because of the cost cap of what upgrades they were going to do and how they were going to build up the car. So in that case, it sounds like this would probably be a behind the scenes discussion point, maybe not the overriding point, but an element of, okay, we only have enough money to do X. And if they're of similar driving styles, this is another way of testing out whether or not we need to build out and spend the money.
Right.
Okay. Wow.
Yep. Right.
Okay.
Because you're doubling the amount of data from a similar style.
Yeah. Well, this is so cool. We could keep talking, as we know. I love listening to you, Professor. But I feel like this is something that we definitely would love to hear from any of our listeners. If they want us to go unpack even more of this, I'm definitely going to have to use a Dick phrase, a think on this of other questions I might have. But I really appreciate you, Dick, taking the time, because it's actually been a concept I have struggled with quite a bit. I've watched videos trying to understand this, and I've not really had this kind of detail to help me see better what I understand is a critical component for the racing. So
well, I'm glad to help. And, this is the fun kind of stuff, because it allows me to think, okay, what is my driving style and what is it that I like, and all that kind of stuff. And, some people who know me, who are my racing friends, would say, well, your style is slow in, slow out. But, I'm not going to go there. But I do tend to like a car that has maybe just a little bit of understeer coming in, although I'm pretty happy to deal with a car that's maybe a little bit oversteery, actually, going into the corner. And then a very small amount of oversteer coming off the corner, because you get too much oversteer. For me, it slows me down.
That makes sense. Well, maybe that's something people should be jumping onto your channel and watching some of your efforts to not be slow in, slow out, but to these preferences that you just said. I think that would be a great opportunity for people to have the visual component to what we just discussed verbally. So, okay, that's perfect. I look forward to our next conversation, Dick.
So do I. Thank you.
Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, sabrina@2guysagirlandf1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.